Welcome to Cold Case Mystique. In today's video, we're diving into a collection of intriguing cold cases that have baffled investigators for years. We'll explore the mysterious details, the twists and turns, and the latest updates that might just crack these cases. Let's unravel these mysteries together. Alexis Miranda Badger. On June 23, 1974, Alexis Miranda Badger was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her real mother put her up for adoption when she was 5 months old. She spent some time in foster care before being taken in by the Michigan-based Bowman family. Andrea Bowman became her new name. Andrea, at 14 years old, told her high school staff about it in 1988. She was afraid to return home. The police were called to the school. Dennis, Andrea's adoptive father, was allegedly improperly touching her. Dennis and his spouse rejected the accusations. They said Andrea was only angry since she had just learned she was adopted. Allegan County is a remote place where the Bowman family relocated shortly after this tragedy. Andrea's adoptive parents reported her missing not long after the transfer. Dennis said that Andrea had stolen from them and fled. When Dennis Bowman vanished, she had a noteworthy criminal history. He was taken into custody in 1980 because it was alleged by a young lady that he tried to entice an attacker in a forest. He entered a guilty plea. In 1998, 10 years after Andrea vanished, Dennis was taken into custody for breaking into an Ottawa County co-worker's house and taking her pants. In 1999, a Jane Doe was found in a Wisconsin cornfield the next year. There was enough of a resemblance to raise the possibility that it was Andrea, but she was eliminated. In case you were wondering, Becky Johnson was eventually recognized as the Jane Doe. Dennis Bowman was taken into custody in November 2019 for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle, a 25-year-old. Early in 2020, Dennis acknowledged that he had taken Andrea, his adoptive daughter, from her parents. He directed them to the location of her remains. The 200 block of 136th Avenue in Monterey Township, Allegan County, is where Andrea's bones were discovered. If found guilty, he might spend the rest of his life behind bars. If you're fascinated by true crime and enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up to stay updated on all our latest content. Moving on to the next case. Blanca Mabel Otero Alvarez. In the Argentine province of El Chaco, the village of Cuitlapai is where Blanca Mabel Otero Alvarez was born in 1952. After Blanca became 21, her family relocated to Silices, her parents' hometown in Spain. In Argentina, Blanca worked as a school teacher, but finding employment in Spain proved to be difficult. She eventually obtained employment with the National Railroad Board. To be nearer to her job, Blanca moved away from home and settled in Leon City, while she continued to see her parents once a week. Then one day she was gone. Nothing was taken with her when she left. Her father did not want her family to file a missing persons report, therefore they initially chose not to. When it came time to report Blanca missing, it was in 1997. She would have been 45 years old by then. After Blanca was reported missing, the authorities located her in Guahan after a few days. But she did not want to communicate with her relatives. She informed the police. Despite their disappointment, her family was resolved to see her again. They traveled to Guahan, where they discovered that Blanca had given up her flat and moved on after realizing they were approaching. Blanca sent a message and a picture of herself to her family in 2005. She promised to stay in touch with her family and begged her father's forgiveness in the letter. However, she never did. Blanca relocated to the La Fresnada estate and changed her name to Ava, a decision that her family was unaware of. She was taking care of her kids and pets, cleaning houses, and working. Her neighbors had known her for years, but they were unaware that she had vanished. La Fresnada locals called the local police department multiple times in August of 2020. They hadn't seen their neighbor Ava in a few days, which worried them. To enter her home, the police had to pry open the windows. They entered and saw 68-year-old Ava lounging on the floor in her living room. She was thirsty, seemed cognitively absent, nonverbal, disoriented, and didn't seem to be aware of anything going on around her. She was brought to Central University Hospital in Astoria. They made an effort to find her next of kin. Then, it was found that Avio is not listed in the local census. She was finally recognized as Blanca Otero Alvarez, who had gone missing. After being called, her family reportedly expressed shock at learning that Blanca had been located and was still alive. Even at 90 years old, Blanca's mother still needs to be informed that her daughter has been located. Moving on to the next case. Christine Jessop. 9-year-old Christine Jessop was a resident of Queensville, Ontario, Canada. Christine's mother and her elder brother Kenny attended Kenny's dentist visit on October 3, 1984. Bob, Christine's father, was incarcerated. This implied that Christine was abandoned at the house by herself. When Christine's mother and Kenny got home at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they saw Christine was gone. Despite being told to stay inside, they presumed she went out to play, so they weren't frightened right away. They started to grow concerned after a little while, and the police were summoned. Queensville is a little town with about 600 residents. The town was alerted to her disappearance, and the hunt for her began right away. A witness came forward and said that, shortly before 4 p.m., he had seen Christine at the store purchasing gum. The police determined that her situation constituted an abduction after conducting a search of the immediate vicinity of her residence. All of her relatives and acquaintances were questioned. Paul Morin, Christine's neighbor, was one of the individuals that was investigated by the police. Why the police were so interested in him is unknown. He lived with his parents, was in his 20s, and had no prior criminal record that would suggest he might be interested in kidnapping a young child. His car also piqued the interest of a police dog. The cops disregarded the fact that he had a very strong alibi. Christine's body was discovered on New Year's Eve 1984, a few months after she was last seen. It was in a pasture about 25 miles from Queensville. After being beaten, Christine was stabbed. On her pants, the DNA of a male suspect was discovered. DNA was still a relatively new technology in 1980, and there weren't many applications for it. For future use, the investigators preserved it. Christine, 9 years old, was still in question. Who did this to her? Guy Morin remained the focus of the police, who conducted multiple interviews with him. That resulted in his arrest by them. Although it's unclear exactly what he said, he seemed strange and knowledgeable about the location where she was located. It did not assist his cause that the media painted him as a deranged recluse who was infatuated with Christine. A prisoner who was awaiting trial stated that G had admitted to him that it was what killed Christine. In a subsequent trial, the jury concluded that G. Morin had killed her. Guy challenged this ruling. That was 1995. DNA technology had progressed a little bit by that point. Following DNA testing, it was established that the suspect's DNA did not match Guy Morin's DNA recovered at the crime scene. Guy was found not guilty. In addition, he received $1,200,000 for his false conviction. This implied that after 11 years, the detectives were back at square one, and that it would take another 25 years to solve this case. The Toronto police declared in October 2020 that they had identified the individual who had killed Christine via genetic genealogy. By comparing a sample to a DNA database, genetic genealogy matches DNA analysis with genealogical research to establish a likely suspect and establish a familial tie. It's Calvin Hoover who has been identified. He was a friend of the Jessop's family. When the crime was committed, he was 28 years old. In 2015, Calvin took his own life. According to investigators, he would have been taken into custody for the crime if he were still living today. Despite not being a suspect in the case, he was considered a person of interest due to his proximity to and familiarity with the family. Calvin attended Christine's burial in addition to helping with the search for her. The news has relieved Christine's family, but they are still in disbelief that a person they know could have perpetrated such a horrible act. Moving on to the next case. Emmett Veltin. On April 24, 2011, at around 8:10 a.m., 69-year-old Emmett Veltin and an unidentified male went into his condominium complex, which is around 2300 North Central Avenue. The young man and Veltin went side by side from the parking lot into Veltin's apartment building and into the elevator after leaving the doctor's RAV4. After 2 hours, Veltin's guest came out by himself. He discreetly stole Veltin's car by using the stairway back to the parking lot. 3 days later, the police found the car, but even with the video and a clear, bloody footprint removed from the apartment, Veltin's murder is still unsolved. The victim himself provided what may have been the most promising lead in Veltin's homicide investigation. He lived long enough to inform police that he had picked up the suspect at the downtown Phoenix homeless shelter cast. He was alert when police first arrived. Although Veltin was openly gay, he kept his personal life largely hidden from his pals. Veltin had never addressed picking up strangers for amorous encounters, according to friend Brad Stacy, and he couldn't have imagined that would be a part of Veltin's life. Veltin has never been known by the police to use prostitutes, but there was a sexual undertone to the crime. After the suspect had been gone for around 45 minutes, Veltin came out of his flat, his pants half off and his head bleeding. After seeing him lying near the elevator, a neighbor phoned the police. Investigators were informed by Veltin that the man had shackled his legs and physically assaulted him until he passed out. Shortly later, he passed away in the hospital. It didn't seem like robbery was the reason. Veltin's residence was found to be empty of any missing items, and the suspect quickly abandoned the stolen car. Shortly after the attack, security personnel saw the RAV4 at North 35th Avenue and West Glendale Avenue. On the other hand, it wasn't reported to the police until April 27th. The man's image was given in passing in the video. It is assumed that he was no taller than 5'9", as he was clean-cut, skinny, and white. Pixels partially covered the suspect's face, and he never appeared to be facing the proper direction. However, the authorities thought that some of the goods he had on that day may aid in his identification. The man wore a neon green baseball cap and carried a tan messenger bag. After testing one lead's footprints, authorities dismissed him before interviewing him further. Police had a ton of potential physical evidence at Veltin's house. The door handles, an electrical cable, and an empty beer bottle, according to the police, but the results were either inconclusive or empty. The beer bottle is currently being resubmitted to investigators for more thorough examination. Detective Dominic Rosenberg of the Phoenix Police Department stated in a recent interview that, aside from the footage, it's highly likely the culprit wasn't a local. He is not under our jurisdiction. Police ask that anyone with knowledge on this or any other cold case get in touch with Silent Witness at 480-948-6377 or silentwitness.org. Moving on to the next case. Lieutenant Felix Moncler. First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncler was a pilot for the United States Air Force who vanished without a trace in 1953 as he was conducting an air defense intercept over Lake Superior. This event is now commonly referred to as the Kinross Incident, which was called after Kinross Air Force Base, which was the location where Felix was stationed temporarily at the time of his disappearance. A target that had not been identified was brought to the attention of the Air Defense Command Ground Intercept Radar Controller at Troy Air Force Base on the evening of November 23, 1953. Kinross Field Base, which is located close, dispatched an F-89C Scorpion jet to the scene. When the Scorpion jet neared the target at a speed of more than 500 miles per hour, ground control saw that the target had changed its trajectory. They then directed the jet in the direction of the target. The jet made an attempt to close the gap for a period of 30 minutes while the UFO was accelerating over Lake Superior. The distance that separated the two blips on the radar screen shrunk and shrunk until the two blips were reduced to a single blip. This occurred while ground control was watching. The ground control believed that Moncler had flown over the objective and that the two blips would split apart once more as he went from one location to another. Nevertheless, this did not take place. The single blip suddenly disappeared from the screen, and the radar screen was completely devoid of any trace of its previous appearance. The ground control team attempted to make radio contact with the jet, but they did not receive any answer. There was not a single trace of the plane or its pilot after an all-night search that included both air and water rescue operations. Not a single piece of debris, not a single oil slick, and nothing. The authorities published a statement claiming that the Scorpion jet had exploded at a high altitude, but they chose to ignore the fact that this would have resulted in a significant amount of debris being left on the surface of the lake. In addition, any and all references to Moncler's mission had been removed from the official records. According to reports, both aircraft vanished at the same moment, which has led many people who are interested in UFOs to suspect that Moncler's aircraft was involved in a collision with the UFO. When it comes to Lieutenant Felix Moncler, it appears that we might never find out what happened to him. Moving on to the next case. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. In Neenah, Wisconsin, on March 26, 1940, Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was born. By all accounts, a number of things contributed to his upbringing, which was described as turbulent and difficult. Most notably, the family's many moves and his father's verbal and drink abuse. In school, he was regarded a loner, and he looked to be particularly interested in bondage and sadomasochism from an early age, while he began peeping as a teenager. He allegedly tied himself to trees in remote locations in an attempt to induce autoerotic asphyxia. This tactic would recur in his subsequent killings. Schaefer attempted and failed for a number of years to become a teacher before joining the Wilton Manors Police Department in September 1971 at the age of 25. His service with the Wilton Manors Police was short, 6 months, but he did win one commendation. Overall, his performance at work was viewed as subpar, and when his supervisors learned that he routinely stopped female drivers for offenses, they fired him. After getting their personal information, he would utilize it to get in touch with the women and make a date request. The police in Wilson Manor did not put up with his improper behavior, but it did not prevent Schaefer from finding work in law enforcement elsewhere. He applied to work as a constable with the Martin County Sheriff's Department in Florida in 1972, and after forging a recommendation letter from his former police employers, he was given the job offer. Fortunately, Schaefer's initial victims managed to flee without harm. On July 21, 1972, Nancy Trotter, then 18, and Paula Wells, then 17, were picked up by Schaefer, who happened to be on duty when they were hitchhiking. He drove the two to their intended destination, the city of Stuart, but not before he forewarned them about the perils of taking rides from strangers. The females clarified that neither of them was from Florida and that they were going to Jensen Beach the next day. Using this as a chance, Schaefer offered them a lift to the beach the next morning, and they accepted. But instead of going there, he drove them to a remote woodland and stopped the car near a rundown cottage. Then he put the females in handcuffs and gagged them. Nancy was led by him to a tree, where a noose was fastened around her neck and her legs were bound to the trunk just below her knees. The 18-year-old had to stand on the tree's roots to keep the rope from tightening because the situation was so dangerous. Paula was led to another tree and fastened similarly. Schaefer warned the girls that they were going to be sexually assaulted and killed, but before he could follow through on his pledge, he received a radio call instructing him to head straight to the police station. When Schaefer went, and came back 2 hours later. Neither of the females was there. Telling Sheriff Robert Crowder, "I've done something very foolish." He phoned him right away. "I'll make you angry." He clarified that he had overdone the job and had left the 2 girls in swampland, but that he was only attempting to teach the girls a lesson about the risks of hitchhiking. Luckily, Nancy was discovered swimming in a river with her gags still covering her mouth and her hands locked behind her back. There were rips and tears in her clothes. Paula had been found a little while earlier, meandering towards the roadway through the forest. Though understandably traumatized, neither girl suffered any physical harm. Nancy and Paula recounted their escape and their conversations with Schaefer back at the police station. Schaefer did not hold his account of events up, even though he maintained that he had just gone too far in trying to warn the ladies about the hazards they took while hitchhiking from strangers. He was swiftly removed from the force, taken into custody, and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. But 2 weeks later, he posted bail, setting himself free until his trial in November. Schaefer kidnapped 2 teenage girls, Georgia Jessop, 16, and Susan Place, 17, on September 27, 1972. They had met Schaefer at an adult education center in Fort Lauderdale, where he had presented himself as Jerry Shepherd. Schaefer had gained their trust by acting as though they shared their interests. When they presented Schaefer to Susan's mother, the 2 girls informed her that they had planned to spend a few days at the beach with him. Lucille, Susan's mother, took notice of this Jerry Shepherd's number plate number and expressed suspicion about him. At 8:45 that evening, Susan and Georgia were last saw leaving the property with Schaefer. Concerned, Susan and Georgia's parents called the police to report their disappearances after 4 days without seeing either of them. Even though Susan's mother, Lucille, sent the number plate number she had jotted down to the authorities, the registration was linked to an entirely other case of the girls' disappearance. The case was soon abandoned. Regarding the girls' abduction, meanwhile, Schaefer made an appearance in court in December 1972. He made a plea agreement in which he admitted guilt to 1 count of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 1 year in prison with the possibility of release after 6 months. After that, he had to complete 3 years of probation. In July 1973, he started his prison sentence. A breach in the Susan Place and Georgia Jessop family occurred in the spring of 1973 when Lucille Place found a letter from Jerry Shepherd in her daughter's bed. The letter's return address directed her to an apartment building, where the management of the building told her that Schaefer, who had just been sentenced to prison for the kidnapping and attempted hanging of 2 girls, was the tenant of the same unit she was looking for. Lucille quickly came to the realization that she had also erred in her note-taking of his number plate number. She had misreported that it was registered in the wrong jurisdiction. Following her report of this inaccuracy to the police, they were able to identify Schaefer as the guy who had been in Lucille's daughter's room the night she vanished, despite Schaefer's denial of any knowledge of Georgia or Susan. The severely decomposed bodies of 2 adolescent girls were found in Oak Hammock Park in Port St. Lucie, Florida, on April 1st. Very little clothing was discovered at the scene, with the only noteworthy item that remained being a pair of jeans with a patch showing Roadrunner, the cartoon bird from Looney Tunes. Parts of the remains had been spread around by nature. The 2 victims had been killed while bound. A knife or machete had severed numerous of their bones, and their spinal cords had been severed at the lumbar region. Their jaw bones displayed evidence of fractures, and they had been beheaded after death. A .22 caliber handgun had shot one of the bodies in the lower jaw. The bodies of Georgia Jessop and Susan Place were quickly recognized. The owner of the Roadrunner jeans was Georgia. Schaefer was named as the police's top suspect shortly after the identification, based on Lucille Place's information and his criminal history. They started looking into it right away. Investigators found 300 pages of violent, twisted stories Schaefer had pinned over the years inside his mother's home. They described in graphic detail the kidnapping, humiliation, sexual assault, and deaths of several young women and adolescent girls whom he derogatorily called sluts and whores. He described in his writings how he would often return to the locations of his murders to perform necrophilia with the severed corpses, occasionally even taking teeth out of his victims' skulls as mementos. The property was searched by police, and they found a lot of softcore pornography, most of which he had altered to depict nude women bound with ropes hanging from trees or with bullet wounds, as well as 11 weapons, 13 hunting knives, lengths of rope, and other items. Investigators also found a letter from an Australian guy they had met in Morocco in 1970 that included more Polaroid pictures of a Saharan hamlet massacre, along with 37 Polaroid pictures of women being hung or disfigured. The majority of the photos featured ladies with injuries. The fact that Schaefer, like many serial killers, had retained mementos from his victims was even more incriminating. Authorities found jewelry, passports, and clothing inside a jewelry box that belonged to people they thought were his victims. One gold lock bearing the name Lee was connected to Lee Bonadies, a woman who went missing. She had disappeared in September of 1969, having been Schaefer's neighbor that year. A further item of jewelry discovered, a heart-shaped charm bearing the initials MTN, has not yet been connected to any individual. Barbara and Wilcox's driver's license was also found. In January 1973, Barbara, then 19 years old, disappeared while traveling from Sioux City, Iowa. She was going with the 19-year-old Colette Goodenough. Together with Barbara's driver's license, Colette's passport was found. At the time of their disappearances, Schaefer was known to have been in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. When their corpses were found in 1977, there was indications that they had been hanging from trees at the murder scene. Schaefer is firmly thought to have been a serial killer even though he was only ever charged with the deaths of 2 victims. At least 8 people's teeth and bones were discovered on his mother's land. Additional tangible proof was discovered in Schaefer and his wife's shared residence, which contained Georgia Jessop's suede purse that he had purportedly given her as a present in November 1970, 2 months after her disappearance. In addition, they discovered 2 human teeth, a number of knives and firearms, and a pillowcase badly stained with blood that he had clearly tried to clean. Schaefer was connected by May 1973 to 9 homicides and 9 unresolved cases of missing persons that occurred between 1969 and 1973. Even yet, one newspaper ran a list of 28 people who were either murdered or went missing and were thought to be connected to the former police officer. Schaefer was accused on May 18, 1973, with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of Georgia Jessop and Susan Place. That September, he was found guilty on both counts. After that, he was handed 2 life sentences that were to be served consecutively. In spite of the evidence against him, Schaefer persisted in claiming his innocence. Then, while maintaining that he had never met either girl, he accused Susan Place and George Jessop of being promiscuous, cop informants, heroin addicts, and even of insulting their parents. Schaefer was a recluse and an outcast in prison. Because of his image as a police informant, which wasn't wholly made up, the other inmates didn't want to associate with him. While he was incarcerated, he assisted in the conviction of multiple pedophiles. Schaefer, 49, passed away on December 3, 1995, from multiple stab wounds caused by fellow prisoner Vincent Rivera, 32, who was already serving a sentence for murder. Days prior to Schaefer's passing, according to police reports, the 2 got into a fight about who got the last cup of hot water from a dispenser. After Rivera was found guilty of Schaefer's murder in 1999, his 20-year sentence was increased by 53 years. Although Rivera never acknowledged the crime or provided an explanation, it is believed that Schaefer was killed because he was an informant. He had multiple instances of rubbish being thrown at him and his cell being set on fire in the year before to his death. For many, one of Florida's most vicious and sadistic murderers, the murder was a just and appropriate conclusion. Moving on to the next case. Jackie Sutton, an activist and humanitarian worker, was discovered dead and alone in a lavatory at Istanbul's Ataturk Airport in October of 2015. Her death was a sudden and unexpected occurrence. Due to the fact that this discovery was so peculiar and inexplicable, the news spread all over the world, which resulted in the Turkish police conducting an inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the death almost immediately. The overall conclusion, on the other hand, caused many who were close to Sutton to disagree with their findings and state that nothing about the case made any sense. Sutton was found to have committed suicide in the restroom, according to the findings of the investigation. Several Turkish media outlets said that Sutton had committed suicide after becoming distraught over the fact that she had missed a flight to Iraq and did not have sufficient funds to purchase another ticket. This, however, was something that the friends of the British campaigner did not approve of at all. Due to the fact that Sutton was a tough individual who had served for a considerable amount of time in both Afghanistan and Iraq, many people asserted that there must have been some sort of criminal activity involved in her passing. However, in June of that same year, Sutton did express her concern that she would be targeted by ISIS. She also mentioned that she has experienced other weird experiences in the past. According to her account, she was once imprisoned by a spy in Intrusion while she was reporting in Baghdad during the 1980s. Additionally, she narrowly avoided being killed in a bombing that occurred in Baghdad. She never wavered in her commitment to her work and the cause she was fighting for. The fact that her death was deemed a suicide adds to the sense of disbelief and the peculiar incidents of her passing. Moving on to the next case. Jessica Bagan. Jessica Bagan, 17, resides in Sitka, Alaska. She concluded her 17th birthday celebration at her sister's home on May 4, 1996. She made the decision to walk as her parents' house was only a mile away. She was celebrating, so she was allowed to remain out later than her normal curfew, which was around 1 in the morning. Her parents weren't concerned at first. They thought she had lost her sense of time and was still celebrating. But as the evening wore on, they began to worry that something might have happened to her, so they made a missing persons report with the police. That night, Jessica never returned home, and she was never seen alive again. A green Letterman jacket, a sock, some jewelry, and a blouse were discovered by the police next to a cycling route 2 days after she vanished. Jessica was the owner of all these clothes. This bike path was frequently used by students to travel to and from the neighboring Sheldon-Jackson College campus. Jessica's body was discovered in a forested area next to the bike path a few hours later. After being attacked, she was strangled. Her blackened eyes gave away that she had been hit in the head or face. Within a week following the incident, Richard Bingham, a caretaker at a nearby college, admitted to the crime. He would later learn that his confession was untrue, even though he was aware of important details. In 1997, a jury found Richard not guilty due to insufficient physical evidence. A private investigator was engaged by Jessica's family, but the investigation was fruitless. Throughout 100 DNA profiles were analyzed throughout the years, but the case was abandoned when no matches were discovered. Subsequently, in 2019, detectives utilized a public genetic genealogy database to obtain a sample of the suspect's DNA profile, which they then utilized to identify a potential suspect. Doubting, at last, they were given a name: Stephen Allen Branch. Officers visited the now 66-year-old suspect at his Austin, Arkansas, home in August 2020 for an interview after he moved there in 2010. In addition to denying any participation, Stephen refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample for comparison with the victim's profile. Documents reveal that in Sitka, Stephen Branch had attacked another adolescent girl in the same year Jessica Bagan was killed. Still, he was found not guilty. Liz, Stephen Branch committed suicide an hour later following the police questioning. During his autopsy, the police were granted a warrant to take a sample of his DNA, which would then be compared to a profile discovered at a crime scene. A match was made. After more than 20 years and one fake confession letter, Jessica Bagan's case, who was 17 at the time, was ultimately resolved. Moving on to the next case. Mark Jeffrey Dribben. 42 years old. Mark in 1999. Jeffrey Dribben resided in Portland, Oregon. He was employed by United Airlines. Mark had a family emergency on July 2nd, so he called his work and asked to be let off for the night. He was spotted at the Eagle Tavern on Burnside Street the following day. His manner was unremarkable in any way. Mark Dribben was last seen by anyone at that point. He was a trustworthy employee. Mark had a strong bond with his family as well. Friends and relatives did not think Mark had just up and left town. Investigators visited his home. They discovered that his car had been stolen and that several valuables were missing. Blood was discovered in large quantities on his home's walls. Someone obviously made an effort to tidy it up. No evidence of forced entry was present. A few weeks later, his automobile was discovered in a location he didn't usually visit. The detectives searched everywhere, but they were unable to locate Mark. However, based on what they discovered inside his home, they were quite certain that he was the victim of foul play. The case was abandoned. Mark's case was reopened by the police's cold case team in March 2019. They sent a private lab the suspect's DNA from his case for forensic genealogical examination. I'm not precisely sure where the DNA originated. It might have been in his residence or in his automobile. Ancestry.com and 23andMe are two examples of publicly accessible databases that the private lab compared the DNA in. Further additional testing and research. Christopher Lovren, 52, was taken into custody by the police in May 2020. He resided close to Mark's residence. How the two men knew one another is unclear. It is believed that the two men's failing friendship was the reason for Mark's death. Some questions remain unanswered even after the case has been resolved. Why did Christopher take Mark's life? And where was Mark's body buried by him? This is what Mark's 87-year-old father had to say. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Portland Police Department and the whole judicial system for their tireless efforts in advancing this matter to this stage. Moving on to the next case. Mary London. Mary London attended Sacramento High School as a sophomore, age 17. She had developmental disabilities. Mary was reported missing on January 14, 1981, following her non-attendance of a prearranged school transportation. Her body was discovered the following day, on January 15, early in the morning, discarded on the side of the road west of Interstate 5. At a crime scene, the only thing the Sacramento Police Department could do was get the suspect's DNA. Detectives have been working on Mary's case for decades in an effort to identify the culprit. Detectives revived the case in 2016, which was 35 years after the crime. They requested assistance from the public in locating a man by the name of Daryl. Although Daryl was not on the police's list of suspects, they nevertheless wanted to speak with him as a friend of Mary's. The suggestion to use genetic genealogy to aid in the case's resolution came from Daniel Hahn, the head of police in Sacramento. In an attempt to find a match, the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was submitted into databases. Daniel Hahn and street lawyer Anna Marie Schubert declared in April 2020 that they thought they had finally found Vernon Parker, the man who killed Mary London. In 1982, Parker's life was taken, 1 year following Mary's death. According to the district attorney, investigative genetic genealogy has completely changed how law enforcement investigates violent crimes, finds the guilty, and clears the innocent. Investigators and Mary's surviving family are thankful for the information even if Vernon Parker will not go to jail for his crime. As Esther, Mary's sister, put it, they really did work hard to figure out who done it. I appreciate all of the people that worked on the case. Moving on to the next case. Mary Scott. Mary Scott, at 24 years old, resided in San Diego, California, in 1969. She and her spouse and their 2 girls used to reside in Louisiana. She moved to California by herself after her marriage did not work out. Mary started out as a cocktail server before moving on to become a dancer at a nearby club under the stage name Lucky. After she failed to arrive for work, I went to check for her at her flat. Mary had been beaten and then strangled, and her body was within. Her door's chain was broken, and the furnishings was a mess. Although detectives followed a number of leads and periodically inquired about her relatives, the case ultimately came to a dead end. Over time, DNA technology developed to a very high degree. Rosalie Sands, Mary's sister, observed this. Why can't DNA technology aid solve her sister's case? She wondered to herself. In 2019, Rosalie then got in touch with a friend who was a retired police officer. He then made contact with former police officers, and so the case was reopened. Using forensic genealogy and DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1969, the San Diego Police Cold Case Unit was able to identify a suspect. A DNA test revealed John Jeffrey Sipos, 75, to be the person they were looking for. When the crime occurred in 1969, John was serving in the Navy in San Diego. John was taken into custody in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania, on October 24, 2020. He's being held at a detention center in Lehigh County right now. Rosalie made this statement after discovering who killed her sister. The thing that upsets me the most is that he continued to live his life. It bothers me that he led such a regular life for so long after learning that he is content and free. Her life was robbed of so much opportunity that lay ahead of her. It took 50 years to solve this case, making it one of the first unsolved homicide cases involving DNA. Moving on to the next case. Max Headroom broadcast Intrusion. Beginning at 9:14 p.m. on November 22, 1987, the programming that was broadcast on televisions in Chicago consisted of a variety of entertainment, news, and game shows that were rather typical. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, those who turned in to WGN in Chicago wanted to watch the channel's primetime newscast. The screen went completely black for 15 seconds while the sports report was being shown, and when it came back on, the individual who was wearing a Max Headroom mask and sunglasses was back on. There was only a buzzing sound, and there was no other sound. Once the engineers at WGN changed the frequency of their studio link, they were able to put an end to this hijack much more quickly. During the course of a television series that was being broadcast on the channel WDTW, the signal of the station was hijacked by the same individual who had previously succeeded in hijacking the signal of WGN earlier that evening. The hijacking occurred at approximately 11:15 p.m. In contrast to the 30-second hijacking that came before it, this one was audio-based and lasted for 1 minute and 22 seconds. In a tone that is reminiscent of a cartoon villain, Max declares, "He is a nerd for crying out loud." Max Headroom was a well-known television figure during that time period, and the metal panel that was spinning hypnotically behind the man was a copycat representation of his bitmapped background. At the same time, the prankster cries out the new Coca-Cola tagline, "Catch the Wave," and hums the theme of the television cartoon Clutch Cargo, which was produced in the 1960s. At one point, the camera cuts to Max, who is facing away from the screen, from a slightly different angle than before. His mask hangs in the vicinity of the camera. However, his buttocks are visible, and his face is not visible on the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, a woman is seen using a fly swatter to give him a serious spanking. Then, in the same instant that it came, the signal becomes relatively noiseless. It was discovered by WETW's engineers that they were unable to stop the signal from coming from the transmitter that was located on top of the Sears Tower. When the engineers finally started looking into what was going on, it was already too late to save the situation. At both WGN and WETW, the phones started ringing off the hook with patrons who were perplexed by the situation. It didn't take long before the incident was carried by the neighborhood newspapers and the local television. A commitment was made by representatives of the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, which is the institution in charge of regulating the airwaves in the United States. To this day, however, we are still unable to determine who was responsible for this hijacking of the program. Moving on to the next case. Michelle Martinko. On October 6, 1961, Michelle Martinko was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was a student at Kennedy High School in Cedar Rapids. Her intention was to get an interior design degree at Iowa State University. Sadly, she was never able to. Michelle attended a function at the Sheraton Inn in Cedar Rapids on December 19, 1979, in the evening. She then asked her buddy if she would like to go shopping with her at Westdale Mall. Michelle made the independent decision to travel when her friend declined. She was last observed outside a jewelry store between 8 and 9 p.m. Michelle was still not home at 2 in the morning, so her father filed a missing persons report. He and the cops started looking for her. Michelle's family's vehicle was discovered in the shopping center's parking area. Michelle's body was slumped over a passenger seat inside. She suffered 29 stab wounds. The crime was committed without witnesses. There were no fingerprints left by the assailant. The attacker's gender was an open question to the police. Michelle did not suffer any indecent assaults, nor were any of her belongings taken. Moreover, the motivation was unclear. There were those who later came forward, stating that they could have seen anything that could aid the inquiry, even though there were no direct witnesses. The witnesses gave a hypnotized description of a Caucasian man who was in his teens or early 20s, around 6 feet tall, and weighed about 170 pounds. Based on this evidence, the police issued a composite sketch on June 19, 1980. Michelle's parents died in 1995 and 1998, respectively, and they never found out who killed their daughter. An investigator was tipped off about the case in 2006. While going over the case files, the investigator discovered something intriguing that had belonged to the attacker, even though the tip itself proved to be fruitless. After that, a DNA profile was made using it. After that, it was added to the Cody's database. Sadly, no matches were found. Then, in 2017, further pictures of the attacker were made by hiring a genetic genealogy company. The pictures were radically different from the ones they had used in 1980. It featured a man with blue eyes and blonde hair. The DNA business entered the data they had gathered into JetMatch in 2018. Law enforcement has also utilized this open-source genealogy database to assist in the resolution of other cases. One individual was discovered who had the suspect's DNA. They were able to construct a family tree with more testing. 3 brothers who had grown up in Manchester, Iowa, were the only ones left. They came under observation. Investigators started gathering their DNA covertly. Jerry Lynn Burns, one of their brothers, was seen by an investigator on October 29, 2018, sipping several sodas with a plastic straw. The investigator gathered the straw after Burns threw it out and ran a DNA test on it. His DNA was confirmed to match the blood recovered at the crime scene by the results that had been obtained. After that, investigators visited his home to speak with him. He said he was not present when Michelle's life was taken and denied ever knowing her. Gerald Burns was hauled into custody on December 19, 2018, precisely 39 years after Michelle was murdered. The jury convicted Jerry Lynn Burns of the crime early in 2020. Then, on August 7th, he received a life sentence without the possibility of release. Moving on to the next case. Mona Blades. At the age of 18, Mona Elizabeth Blades disappeared while trying to hitchhike from Hamilton, New Zealand's North Island. Her story was heavily reported by the media at the time and is among the longest-running unexplained disappearances in the nation. A cold case squad has examined the case in recent years, but the mystery surrounding her disappearance has not been solved. Mona had planned to take a rideshare from her hometown of Hamilton to Hastings on May 31st, 1975, the first day of the Queen's birthday long weekend. She purchased a set of vibrant tumblers for her nephew as a surprise birthday present. Mona was living at the time with her brother-in-law Tom, her sister Lillian, and her infant niece Angela. Tom left his sister-in-law off on Cambridge Road early in the morning. The last time anyone in the family saw Mona was at this event. No one knew that Mona was visiting Hastings because the trip was supposed to be a surprise. Because of this, the adolescent wasn't reported missing until 3 days after she failed to get home on schedule. Although not much is known about the first inquiry, what is known is that over 500 people were looked into over the course of 6 months and 5,000 hours of search work. Not a single piece of evidence that might have revealed Mona Bladez's whereabouts has been discovered, despite the greatest efforts of law enforcement. But little information they did get was a plethora of varied sightings throughout the town. The most famous witness sighting of Mona came from a truck driver who said that at around 10 in the morning, he saw Mona getting into an orange Datsun 120Y station wagon. A similar car was seen by a number of other residents traveling off the highway and coming to a stop on Taupo's rural Madia Road. About 200 meters down the same road, a fencing contractor who was a witness as well noticed the car. He saw that a middle-aged white man was driving and a woman who fit Mona's description was seated in the back. A little while later, the witness saw the car again and discovered it was empty. The orange Datsun lead was regarded as a significant development in the case. The fact that the investigators devoted a significant amount of time to this tip-off might have hurt the case. During the case's 2018 appearance on TV New Zealand's Cold Case series, seasoned investigators went over each case file again in an effort to uncover fresh leads. Re-examining the files, some concluded that the authorities had overlooked several other potentially useful leads because they had focused too much on the Datsun. They also thought that by utilizing an old photo of Mona, the cops might have deceived witnesses. Mona had blonde locks in the police enforcement photo. That being said, she had a mullet at the time of her disappearance. In addition, it was determined that Mona had lived in Taupo for a longer period of time than first believed and may have never left. Furthermore, it was found that the truck driver who had first reported the orange Datsun sighting had altered his account several times, perhaps as a result of hearing or reading about the case. A number of witness reports were disregarded in favor of the orange Datsun tip. One employee of the store, who was acquainted with Mona, reported that they observed her getting into a dark blue-green station wagon and that it drove off towards the Napier-Taupo highway. The 18-year-old, according to the witness, was in the car with another female hitchhiker. An additional sighting was reported by an individual who had conversed with a woman identifying herself as Mona Bladez. On May 31st, in the early afternoon, the woman was spotted at the Spa Hotel in Taupo. A little later, she was seen boarding a red Toyota station wagon. Although the cold case team thought Mona had met and departed with people she knew in Taupo, some detectives have speculated that she might have been kidnapped and murdered that weekend by gang members heading to Wellington. The 18-year-old allegedly had friendships with a number of members of the infamous Highway 61 biker gang. Furthermore, in 2018, an unidentified guy contacted the Rotorua Daily Post claiming that he had been informed by a buddy who passed away in 2013 that Highway 61 was connected to Mona's disappearance. A year after the kidnapping, the gang members allegedly discussed it and claimed to have killed her. It appears that the group was going in a red Toyota, and witnesses noticed two individuals carrying a rolled-up carpet piece to the rear of the car. It's uncertain if the witness who had seen Mona at the Spa Hotel saw the same vehicle. But there are other suspects in this case besides the biker gang. Soon after the investigation started, officials looked into a guy named John Freeman after learning that he had rented an orange Datsun the weekend before the tragedy. After 2 weeks, when the police made it known that they were searching for an orange Datsun, Freeman shot and injured a student at the university before killing himself. It's unclear if Freeman had anything to do with the disappearance of mourners. Charlie Hughes, a Hamilton resident who has provided a DNA sample and been interrogated 3 times since the 1970s, is another man who was the subject of an investigation. Throughout the years, he has consistently maintained his innocence, and he has openly expressed his annoyance at being looked into. A purported shallow grave in the garage of a Huntley home bearing Mona's name was reported to investigators in 2004. It was said to have been a joke when the name was written on concrete 6 years prior. Later on, the ex-homeowner expressed regret to the Blades family. The concrete floor of a Correo home that originally belonged to a traffic cop who passed away in 2009 was excavated by police in 2012. A fellow policeman had accused the officer of kidnapping and murdering Mona. Tony Mueller, the accuser, says he's had his doubts for a very long time. It seems that in 2011, he forwarded an information compilation to the authorities. Authorities arrived at the residence a year later to look under the laundry room floor. Mueller saw police enforcement drill 80 centimeters and then explore an additional 80, and he was confident there was a body beneath the concrete. But under the floor, nothing of significance turned up. Mueller is certain that a body is buried in the house despite this, even though he now thinks it's under the stairwell. The homeowners likewise think this to be true, according to a 2012 New Zealand Herald report, but officials are unable to dig without proof. Mona's case is still unresolved even after it was reopened, and a new investigation was launched in 2018. Moving on to the next case. Nancy Daugherty. Nestled in Chisholm, Minnesota, was Nancy Daugherty. She was married, with 2 children. Her spouse was serving with the Air National Guard abroad. Nancy held part-time jobs as a carer in a nursing home and as a barman. She had a lover in addition to being unfaithful to her spouse. Nancy went out drinking with her boyfriend on July 15, 1986. The boyfriend then dropped her off at her house. When he called Nancy the following morning, she did not respond. Then he requested that she be checked on by the police. When the Chisholm police knocked on her door, nobody picked up. When they did eventually get inside her house, they discovered something shocking. The body of Nancy Daugherty lay on the ground. Before being strangled, she had been abused and assaulted. At the scene of the incident, DNA evidence belonging to a potential suspect was recovered by the police. Next, a DNA profile was made. Nevertheless, no one in a criminal database matched the profile. More than 100 persons were questioned by the police, and their DNA was gathered, but it was fruitless. Since he was the last person to have seen her, the boyfriend was investigated for a short while. He was excluded, though, as was the spouse. Sadly, the case was abandoned by the police since they had run out of leads. Subsequently, in 2020, officers working for the Chisholm Police Department came up with the notion of getting in touch with Parabon Nanolabs, a business that assists law enforcement agencies in finding leads by analyzing public genealogical databases. The work of Parabon Nanolabs was found in a parent match. Michael Allen Carbo Jr., 52, resides in Chisholm, Minnesota. A few questions were raised by Michael's identification. Nancy was unknown to Michael, who was only a teenager when she was killed. In 1986, he was not even a person to be interested in. Nevertheless, a subsequent analysis did confirm that Michael's DNA matched the first profile. He may receive a term of up to 40 years in jail for the actions that led to his arrest in July of 2020. This is the day Nancy Daugherty's family and the entire town of Chisholm have waited for over 34 years, stated the chief of police of Chisholm, Vern Manor. In addition, he delivered a message from Gina, Nancy's daughter. Helping people was my mother's passion. The horrible voids that were left in so many lives, including mine, are beyond words. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.